Well, first of all, Judee, I really want to thank you for coming to talk with me about your engagement in interpersonal communication as a researcher. I know I have followed your work so closely over the years, and you've had such an important impact, especially on our study of nonverbal communication, but also on nonverbal communication in the context of interpersonal interaction, how we exchange messages and react to each other nonverbally. And I think that's where you've really made such a contribution.
Well, thank you.
So I think for our students who are at the very beginning of their careers, I think an interesting question is, how did you become interested in studying communication, and what drew you to this career, or why is this your passion?
Well, one of the things I've discovered over the years is a lot of us came into this discipline through debate. Mm-hmm. And even before debate, I had a teacher who did something I'm sure many people have never heard of, called a voice choir. And she taught all of us to do things like poetry and passages from literature, and you'd have an entire choir of people who would then recite these things in a choral fashion. And in some ways, because she was such a passionate teacher and she loved the whole field of speech, and it was called speech, I think that's where some of my interest in nonverbal communication started. And then when I went on for my graduate work, there really was no material in the area of nonverbal communication. And Jim McCroskey was doing a seminar on that topic, and we were asked, each of us, to just go out and find whatever we could because there were no books. Mm-hmm. So we just gathered all this material. And I think every one of us came out of that class just really ignited by all the possibilities. It was just a fun topic and so many different directions you could go with it. So maybe partly coming into the discipline because of the debate interest and the interest on the verbal side, but also how you presented things. And of course, all of us had to take lots of public speaking classes and oral interpret and those kinds of courses. So that, I think, partly fueled the interest.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things you've certainly done in your career has been to look at how nonverbal communication happens in the stream of interpersonal interactions and the ways in which the things we might do to surprise somebody nonverbally changes the course of the interaction. Mm-hmm. And so, within this chapter, our students are learning about the different meanings that people attach to different kinds of nonverbal messages, but you've really located those within the ongoing stream of interaction. So when you think about the work on nonverbal communication, are there a few things that stand out for you as being especially important interpersonal communication findings or nonverbal communication findings?
Of course, and when I was going through the book and just jumping ahead and looking wherever you mention nonverbal communication, and it permeates everything in the textbook. And so it's a little hard to locate particularly important areas because whether you're talking about producing messages and how important nonverbal behaviors are even in our creation of a message. I was struck early on by some work by David McNeil about how verbal and nonverbal components originate in the same place as an impulse to create meaning, and that many times the nonverbal even precedes the words coming out. And there's a really interesting adjunct to this in the deception literature where they're finding that sometimes, let's suppose you're telling a story verbally and you're supposed to lie about it and you're narrating what this event was, your gestures may actually tell the true story because your mind is still has that meaning there. And so there's a really interesting little tell over here, and I'm not talking about just indicating that you're being deceptive, but maybe recreating the real event gesturally here when you're trying to tell a completely alternative version. So that's one area that I think is fascinating, is how nonverbal helps us actually produce our messages. I think a lot of people don't recognize how important it is in governing or regulating the whole interaction process and how much we depend on the nonverbal signals to start and stop conversations, to get in sync with people. And maybe this is one of the areas where I think we have a lot to offer. We recognize how much people coordinate in a very subconscious way, coordinate their interactions. And if that coordination doesn't occur, things just go awry in a hurry. Even things like changing speakers and the fact that you can do it within 1/10 of a second, to me, that's astounding. And when that doesn't happen, and conversations are going flat, and you can't figure out why, people haven't gotten into proper synchronization.
As you were talking about deception and how nonverbal cues help us detect deception, I found myself just dying to ask about the work you're doing related to Homeland Security and deception detection from the security and safety point of view. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the things that's been possible now because of things like computer technology has really enabled us to go far beyond what we used to be able to do. Many people, I think, shied away from nonverbal research because it was really tedious to analyze human behavior and watch micro-momentary activity, and I was no fan of that either. But now computer technology has allowed us to, for instance, capture a person's face and hands automatically from a video and then begin to track things like their gestures, their expressions, and we can now find, for instance, how well people synchronize with one another, and you can watch it over time, and so maybe you're smiling and then I'm smiling and then you stop and I stop, and when we're in sync, that often is indicative of people in a truth-telling situation, but not always. We're finding also that sometimes people who are better at deception, either they're very skilled or maybe they've planned, they've rehearsed what they're doing, they're able to get into the same kind of communication pattern as a truthful person does. This is one of the things that a lot of the psychology research does not take into account, because they'll look at a very brief snippet of deception research and maybe only the first 10 seconds of what happens. That doesn't tell the story, because a really skilled deceiver can very quickly adapt to what you're doing and therefore look very truthful. So you have to get these people off guard. And if you don't, then it's very difficult to detect. Now, one of the things we can do with some of the automated tools is pick up on things that people are not aware that they're doing, that they're not managing, they're not monitoring. So, for instance, some of our work has found that the left hand gets more involved in certain things when people are being deceptive. And they don't realize it, and we don't entirely know what it is. It has nothing to do with handedness, because we did a little experiment to rule that out. But some of these things are now emerging that we can pick up on some very fine-grained activity that is tipping us off. And so one of the things we're trying to do when we're looking at deception from a security standpoint is looking at the things that people are not aware that they're managing, that they're not monitoring, that even if they were rehearsed or they planned what they were saying, we might still see some telltale signs. And there are things like, some things that are involuntary, like a pupil dilation, but other things that they're not going to be aware of, things like head movements and slight head movements, degree to which they are either encouraging somebody else to talk so they can capitalize on that person's mistakes, or things that they're doing that indicate that they're too preoccupied with their deceit and therefore they can't do the usual head movements like we're doing right now with the back channeling. A lot of times if you're a deceiver and you're in a really cognitively overloaded situation, you can't do that because you're way too busy thinking about what you're saying next. So that's one of the interesting things we're looking at. And the technology is also allowing us to match up what's going on, say, with brain waves and where the thought processes are occurring, whether you have the executive function of the brain kicking in or not. So the notion would be, if I have to think of a concocted story, I have to first think about the truth, and that gets processed in one region. Then I have to figure out how to edit that, and then turn that into message production, and think about how that's going to square with anything I said before. So you have this whole process.
And how can that not disrupt the flow of natural nonverbal behavior?
So if we look at how the two people interact with each other, then that's one of the things that's of interest to us. And some of the traditional research, which did not want to take into account what's going on between sender and receiver, never takes that into account. And we can start looking at some of that and seeing what disrupts the whole process as possibly an indication of deception taking place. And I mentioned, so I'm talking a lot about gestures and facial expressions, but we can do a lot with the voice now, and we're picking up some very interesting indications in the voice. We're picking up some things that have to do with immediacy, which you talk about in your textbook. and whether or not people are being more immediate or less. But we also talk a lot about people's strategies. And if you're really a skilled deceiver, you may go on the offense and do a lot of dominance behaviors. Or maybe you're not such a skilled deceiver. Maybe you'll take a very passive, almost a flight approach as opposed to the fight approach. So we have to look for the kinds of strategies people are engaging in and figure out, is this a context where normally we would expect people to be maybe more assertive and now they're choosing not to be, or vice versa. So we look for anomalies, we look for deviations from the normal pattern. And the technologies are allowing us with near infrared to pick up on eye movements in ways we couldn't before. Thermal imaging is picking up on changes in people's pores. Some of this is absolutely amazing.
That's fascinating. So, Judee, one last question for you then. Talking to our students about their own future careers or their lives or their families or their work situations, what kind of advice would you have for them going forward, given what you've seen your own students do in their careers, or just the takeaway message from work information you've gathered from your own research that they might find useful?
Well, I don't know if this is the answer to the question you're asking, but one of the things that strikes me is communication is such a fascinating area, and you get to take your work with you home. You take it to play, you take it to every part of what you're doing. And if people are studying this because this is what they want to do in the future, they've got to find that area that really gets them up in the morning, that they're passionate about. And there are so many areas in which you can pursue communication. And one of the things I think is very exciting now, and that is getting to work with people from other disciplines. They are now discovering communication. In my area, the nonverbal area, is finally becoming something where people have very naive notions about communication. And whether they're developing near-infrared imaging or they're trying to study deception in employment interviews, or, well, you could just name any number of things. Many times they have such simplistic notions about how communication operates, and I think we have so much to say to them. And this is why if we then team up with other people, we are value added. And I think we have to understand that. So many times our students are having to go home and explain to mom and dad what it is that they do and why this is important, and it's a little hard to articulate that story. But it is truly the case that we tend, first of all, to see things in a more complex way, not this highly simplistic way. And we bring a lot of knowledge to bear to a lot of very real problems in the health field, in the security field, in employment, in child care, family relations, and conflict, and international relations. So the world can be their oyster.
Thank you so much, Judee.